Hi, good evening, everyone. So, welcome to another edition of GMAT Success Stories. And today we have with us uh, Vaishnavi Shetty, who has secured uh, a 700 on GMAT with a Q47, Q48 rather, and V37. So, Vaishnavi happens to be an ex investment banker, and her journey through GMAT prep has been quite an interesting one. And it's something that, through the course of the webinar, obviously, she'll talk about how she managed and what are the things that she took care of to ensure that she reaches to the score that she did. And there'll be a lot of points that all of you can kind of take a note of. Yeah. And the same things and the same strategies, if you were to follow, would kind of pay the dividends for you as well. So without wasting any more time, I'll just invite Vaishnavi. Hi, Vaishnavi.
I guess I'll start from the first time that I started classes with IMS.
Hmm.
I believe it was November last year when I had started, and the classes went on for about a month and a half.
Hmm.
At the time, I hadn't, started studying for the GMAT, which in hindsight would probably have been a good idea to parallelly start working hard at it.
Right.
But in the month of January, I decided to sit down with my OG books and start giving mock tests by the end of the month.
Hmm.
And what I found was I was consistently finding myself at the time in the mid to early 600 range, sometimes even the late 500 range.
Yeah.
um so after repeated attempts, and checking my answers again from my tests, I found that I was making a lot of errors that were completely avoidable. It was probably just being anxious in the moment, and there wasn't any concept gap that I really had at the time. So the lockdown happened. I took a break from doing the GMAT completely because I just decided I didn't want to take the time out of that, and I wanted to focus on work a little more.
Yeah.
So I did that, and then of course you texted me and you were like, "Are you still going to do the GMAT?" And in early August, and I
Yeah.
was like, "Okay, maybe a good time to start back on it." I studied again, and what I found surprisingly is I think I studied for a week, and when I gave the test, I landed a 650, which was probably the highest score I'd gotten even from before.
Yeah.
And I think it definitely helped taking some time off, because what does happen is when you get saturated with information, sometimes you keep making the same mistakes over and over again. So to take a step back from studying for it, I think really did help me. But lo and behold, by the end of August, I gave my in center test, and I got a 590, and it was like devastating because I was like, this was just not happening.
Hmm.
I didn't understand why and what had gone wrong. So of course, you suggested take the ESR, try to understand what were the concepts, that lacked, over what went wrong, essentially try to understand that. And I took it, and from there on, what I decided was I was just going to give mock tests, because I had completely understood that there wasn't a conceptual problem at all. It was just the anxiety of giving the test, and trying to get over the mental block that you have to sit for so long to give this test, because that in itself is a challenge, especially if you've not been studying for a while and you've been in the job setup.
Right.
And that's exactly what I did. I just kept doing tests and revising tests. And in this process, what I thought was so critical was maintaining an error log. Initially in my practice test, I never did it. I just thought it's something that people talk about in blogs and stuff. And I've read millions of those blogs. And I never paid attention to it. I just made draft notes about what I got wrong. But later, what I found was maintaining that error log really helped me reflect on what I did wrong. So I made it so detailed that even the parts where you would generally say that, my attention was poor at this time, I would answer why my attention was poor at that time. Was it because my, reading comprehension topic was too boring for me? Was it a science topic that I wasn't focusing on too much? In quant, why is it that I made that silly error? I think a lot of personal reflection, and I think people take that for granted also, is required when you're doing the test to get a better score. And finally, when I ended up giving the test again, which was an online test, I scored really well despite all the challenges and the interruptions that I had even on that day. So yeah, so
Yeah,
that's
yeah, yeah.
the MBA
I
story.
think there are many interesting points that you shared, especially the last one, analysis of it and picking the bones right out of it, right? So if you were bored, then why were you bored? And analysis to that extent is what reveals as to wherein do the gaps lie. And so you've kind of summarized the entire journey, yeah, very eloquently and in about a few minutes. And everyone would relate with that because on and off you were in probably in two minds whether to write the GMAT or not. But you persevered, and at the second attempt it came off. I reached out to you because I knew that if you did exactly that, you'd be hitting that 700 mark, and you did eventually. And before we start off, and we have a lot of things to talk about, little things that are very important. And before we do, can you just let our students know how did you come to this, or how did you rather arrive at this decision of writing GMAT and probably thinking about pursuing an MBA? How did that happen?
Yeah. So I've did my undergraduate from the University of Exeter, and I did business management.
Mm.
I really wanted to get into consulting. So, I got a placement in Singapore. It was an internship. So I did a brief stint over there. Then I moved back to India and I secured a job with PwC in investment banking. And what I find too often in India is for you to have any sort of progression, you need to get an MBA. And that's explicitly told to you by most people, by most companies, the likes of PwC, Deloitte, the Big Four, or
Right.
even other companies for that matter.
Yeah.
And I was still in two minds of whether I want to continue a corporate career or set up my own practice. I essentially am looking at starting a non banking financial company.
Hmm.
So, a money lending practice essentially. And for me, the MBA became very critical because it is my safety net. So I've already started work in my business and starting to do the processes to set up this company. But if in case that doesn't work out, I want to have the ability of coming back to a corporate career. And that is my MBA story as well. And I think more often than not, what happens is a lot of Indian students get a little fixated on the idea that you just have to do XYZ. But even when you're doing an application for an MBA school, you really need to put in enough thought about why you're taking the steps that you're taking. Why is it important to you? And
Right.
that'll really help you also craft a story for your application.
Exactly. So uh, two purposes kind of served. When you decided to take on this route was to for it to probably come back to the corporate role with a jump in your in the role that you take up, yeah.
Yeah.
And the second one, and something that a lot of people would relate with, MBA being a safety net, right? Something that you can always fall onto. Yeah, and having a clear perspective about what is it exactly that you want out of an MBA would help you, would obviously not, it's good in general because you have that much better clarity, but helps you, or helps you construct your application which is robust, and communicates what exactly needs to be communicated. And that came out of the conversation that we had the other day as well. uh, so yeah, guys, clarity, and so what you're really looking for, where does GMAT and MBA fit into, is something that is very important, as Vaishnavi said. And coming back to where you started your preparation from, so I remember that verbal was always your stronger suit, as opposed to quant. So we'll start talking about quant first. Yeah. How did you go about ensuring that you get to the place that you did eventually with your quant capabilities for GMAT?
So I think the mistake that I made very initially was thinking quantity will help me get to the score I want. And I just kept solving questions after questions. And
Mm.
it really did not affect my score significantly as I thought it would. Because what happens is, once you solve a question, if you get it incorrect, you'll go and see the solution and you'll assume that you've understood what it is.
Right.
But that's just not the case. You need to revisit that question and take enough time, even when you're analyzing it at that moment, even if it takes you like half an hour to sit down with that question and really understand what went wrong, how could you have changed it or done things differently,
Yeah.
is really important. Quantity does not equal a higher score. So I think for quant, that really, really did help me.
Yeah. So quality of practice is much greater than quantity of practice, is what you kind of say. And again, I think what has been the essence of your prep has been the analysis and
Yeah.
really analyzing more than just keeping on solving tons of questions and doing a lot of practice. So coming to this part of it, so you said that you would even if it takes half an hour for you to understand what exactly was the reason. So can you just throw some light on it, because a lot of students don't do that, and coming from someone who has done that will really speak will really speak to the students here. What was it like? What did you why did it take so long, let's say in some of the questions, that you'd sit for half an hour with just the analysis part of it? What was it that you did?
So I think it was essentially broken up a lot for me, because I remember when I'd done classes with you as well, you had said in the beginning, take as much time as you want on every question, just because you need to first understand what is going on. Then you can think to like get better at your accuracy. So that sort of stuck with me. And what I did was, if for example, if I did get a question wrong, I would look at the solution, but in some cases, I would also see what is the conceptual gap, what is it that I can fix. Then I would go back to the video,
Hmm.
that you have on your website, and watch that video again, or the resources that I have, look at those again, come back to that question, see if I can also solve it in another way, and not just in the way that is mentioned in the solution in the book. I also think sometimes the OG has a certain way of solving those questions that may not be the best way for you.
Right. Right.
So I would literally just copy paste those questions on the web, and I would look at like tons of people solving the same questions in different ways.
Different ways.
So
Right.
that kind of really made me understand that question so much better, because you'll be surprised as to how many ways you can solve the same quant question. Like for me, that was, I think, a very key takeaway. So then I got comfortable with what my style of solving that question is.
Hmm.
Something as simple as, do you want to solve it algebraically or do you want to use substitution method, like those kind of differences. So I think that's where quant really, really helped me. And of course, working on my attention span. I think that was also very difficult for me, because not only are you anxious to sit for the test, you're also not able to focus for so long.
Yeah.
So again, practice tests were the only way to go for me in that sense. That really saved me for sure.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that really stands out with, as opposed to someone who has, let's say, devoted the kind of time, and you took a break obviously in between, is that you did not at any stage let yourself get confused with the various resources of practice that are out there. You stuck with, rather than, again, it comes back to the same thing, quality over quantity. You were never solving stuff right from the website or picking up books or practice material, just about available anywhere, as a lot of students end up doing. I think being thorough with OG played an important part in your preparation for quant, which allowed you to stick within that definitive domain of what is required for GMAT. At the same time, you developed the skills around it.
Yeah, for sure. I think OG is actually more than sufficient if you want to get a decent score in the GMAT. Uh, I'm not opposed to the idea of like looking at other resources as well. But again, like you said, and like I said initially, the same thing, quantity does not make a difference, will not help you get a better score at all. And I know IMS has been helpful in the sense that I could come to you for like additional resources if required. If you thought that there's something that I can get better at, you would send me some resources. So I think those things definitely added value.
Right. So We'll come back to it later because I think the way you went about your mocks is also quite interesting. But having talked about quant, where you probably devoted a bit more of a time getting more comfortable with the basics
Mhm.
and just ensuring that you strengthened that particular area and the skills around it. Verbal was always your stronger suit. What was your strategy around it?
So with verbal, I think what I found was I needed to put in effort with my reading comprehension. And that again boiled down to attention,
Hmm.
because when you see long, lengthy, boring essays you have absolutely no knowledge or interest in, it's very easy to get sidetracked and like let your mind like wander around.
Yeah.
So the thing that I did, at least for RC, that I can give like a quick tip is every para that I read, I made like, I didn't take notes for sure because I think that's time consuming, but I made a brief like mental note that this is what this para was talking about.
Right.
So I think that really helps you to understand what the primary purpose of the passage is, which is more often than not a common question in RC.
Mm.
And it also helps you come back to the specific paragraph that you need to look at for very pointed questions.
Right. Right.
And that helped me with improving my RC score for sure. SC, I think, is very rule based. So if you pit pat with your rules, you won't have trouble with SC. And as far as CR is concerned, I struggled a lot with inference questions. So, you know, it is as simple as it is. You just have to find a conclusion to what they have asked you, and it's just the information that's in the text. Do not get like start analyzing it so much that you take your own kind of conclusion and put it in there, because when you spend so much time on that question, you will try to make your own assumptions about things also.
Yeah.
um, and of course, the most critical thing is time. I think you need to be mindful of how much time you're spending on each question, because that is very detrimental to your score. You can't spend 4 minutes on a question and then lose out the rest of the time on the rest of the questions.
Right. Definitely. So I'll come back to that RC point, but this particular point that you said that you can't afford to spend 4 minutes on a question because that would probably, if you do that with two or three questions, that strikes a sense of panic,
Yeah.
and that you might not be able to finish with your section. So how did you ensure that you overcome that? Because I'm sure that you did kind of do that in the initial mocks that you wrote. So
Mhm.
what was it that you did to ensure that you didn't do that again?
So as a personality type, I think I get very fixated on getting everything right. I want to make sure I get this question right. That's
Mm.
why even in my first attempt I didn't end up finishing my paper, neither the
Yeah.
quant, neither the verbal, and that just brought my score down so much more.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I had to change the habit, right? And just get used to skipping questions that I know I don't have a shot at, and get the others right, which I know will pull my score up. So again, that only comes with practice. You need to be comfortable with, just moving on. So I split my time, and I made sure I was meeting those markers each time. So after 10 questions, I have to make sure on the timer there's X amount of time.
Mhm.
That's what really, really got me through.
Okay, so you'll kind of break down a section into three or four parts,
Yes.
engage it with respect to the kind of time that you've taken thus far, and calibrate it accordingly. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
So one of the things that I'd like to elaborate, and a very important and an interesting point that Vaishnavi has made here, is that she'd get hung up on some of the questions and she wanted to get it right no matter what, and that happens with a lot of us. Yeah, everyone wants to do that. uh, but GMAT being a test that tests how good a manager you are, one of the important qualities of a manager is to really, you know, actually figure out or actually have that trait of not getting hung up on things and moving on, not losing that speed. So GMAT as a test would invariably throw questions at you which you would not be able to do, no matter how high up. Even if you score, let's say Q51, you will encounter at least 3 to 4 questions which you think you won't be able to do. That will happen. That's just with the test is. It's an adaptive test. So learn to move on and let go. That is an important skill, and it has nothing to do with either quant or verbal. It's just an organizational skill and a managerial skill that you have to master, and which Vaishnavi did. Uh, through the course of practice, and in this sense, obviously through the course of mock testing, because not doing that reflected kind of, with a bit better score probably in the next mock. And yeah, so I think that that's a really interesting point, and something that say at least 40 to 50% of the students have this fixation of getting the question right and only then moving on. Everyone has that, yeah. So I hope all of you made a note of that. Now coming to the RC part of it, and you talked about how you would scan a passage for the primary purpose, and a particular an entire passage might consist of 3 to 4 paragraphs. How do you so what it kind of hints towards is the way you went about it was not uh, the thorough reading of the entire passage, but getting to understand the GMAT way of conveying ideas through RC passages, right? Where you get a hint of what the passage talks about, and you also got a hint of which are the potential important points where the questions might direct you at. These are the two things that probably you focused on, if
Yes,
I'm not
for
wrong.
RC, absolutely. And get used to doing boring questions. So, I mean, I'm going to be honest, there's some passages that do not interest me. Anything about space, I was just switching off. I
Wow,
could not be
space.
concerned.
That
Yeah.
interests a lot of us.
And unfortunately enough, I think in my first attempt, I got like this huge paragraph about astronomy, and I was just like, I'm not ready for this.
Yeah.
But then what I did was, of course, looked at the resources that I had, looked at OG again, the
Mhm.
questions. And funny enough, because I was able to maintain that error log, I saw that most of my questions that were incorrect really came from those passages. So
Oh,
I
very interesting.
redid
Yeah.
those and saw what I could do better. So again, like you said, summarizing each paragraph in my head. You really don't need to know every detail about it. There is
Mm.
complex jargon over there specifically to throw you off.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just understand the gist of what that paragraph is telling you, make a mental note about it, move on from it. And if you don't get it, if you're like too stuck on it, don't spend too much time because there are enough questions you can make up for.
Right. So very interesting again, to read, to develop that knowledge, or that wisdom of how to read a GMAT passage as such, because if you've done enough and analyze them thoroughly as Vaishnavi did, she kind of took a note of where and what led her to make those particular mistakes, and then you develop a way of solving and going about RCs. By the way, the boring thing, I don't, that's just Vaishnavi's judgment. That's not a fact.
Yeah.
But yeah, what might be boring for Vaishnavi might be some interesting for someone else, and vice versa. Yeah. So just identify what might be boring for you. And for a lot of you, I know RC just is boring. Yeah, no matter what kind of a passage that is. So there's no other way around it, but stick to the process, and that will take away whether it's boring or not. Once you're totally devoted on the process, it doesn't really matter. Yeah. Uh, the CR part you talked about, inference was something that you struggled with,
Mhm.
and you said that if you let your mind take over, then you'd bring in your own set of assumptions. Probably this is where your analysis came into picture, where you kind of analyze, and initially this would happen almost subconsciously,
Yeah.
but after a few probably weeks, you took a note of it and rectified that. So, at what point did you catch, or how did you ensure that you don't bring in your own set of assumptions into
So
solving it?
specifically for inference questions, I really struggled with those because even to the end, I found that I would get stuck between two questions that were very similar to each other, and then be
Right.
wondering how this fits, right, and which one is the right one. Uh, and that is when I started over analyzing my answer choices.
Yeah.
And I started bringing in permutation combinations that I would think is correct, but it's really just as simple as what has the question put there and
Mm.
how does this conclusion fit? Does this conclusion fit with the basic information that's given in the passage? If it does not, then that's not the answer. So yeah, that really is just
Mm.
how I tackle the inference questions.
That's very interesting, because some way you were able to develop that matrix and gain that clarity as to what was it that the passage talked about, and what was it that you brought in from your own end.
Yeah.
and having that clarity led you to getting better at it eventually.
Yeah. And sometimes it's also, I found that sometimes the simplest answer choice is the answer to those inference questions, which you won't want to pick initially because you'll be like, no, it's got to be more complicated than that. But it's
Ah,
really not. It's just really basic. Yeah.
right, right. So very important, guys. And what this basically tells is, especially for some of the harder questions, who you are as a person would lead you to making certain kind of errors, be it data sufficiency in quant, be it inference questions in the verbal reasoning. So really catching hold of that is really catching hold of you as a person and the kind of tendencies that you have. And it's a really interesting journey once you think of it in that regards. Now, talking about data sufficiency, what was it really freaks out everyone because it's not something that everyone, almost no one has seen it before. It's something that is very unique and peculiar to GMAT. How did you develop a strategy around data sufficiency? What was your way of going about the tougher DS questions?
Yeah. So I think forgetting the assumptions you've made from each statement. So I had the tendency of carrying forward the assumption of statement one to statement two, which
Hangover,
is,
yeah.
yeah, which is natural because you're not used to doing these questions. You've never seen a question like this before. You assume that's all the information you have. So I think really getting into the practice of forgetting those individual assumptions
Mm.
were really critical. And I also identified that I struggled with questions that had fractions in them. So any complicated fraction data sufficiency question I would struggle with. So I actually again went back to the concept, spent time trying to really understand fractions well,
Okay.
and I did, and
Mm.
ended up scoring a lot better in DS.
All right, very interesting. So I just want all of you to pay note to this, pay attention to this rather. Uh, while getting used to data sufficiency, fractions was something that bothered Vaishnavi. Fractions is a more basic conceptual thing in mathematics. Yeah. So a lot of what you need to improve upon from the conceptual side gets revealed as you go along, and just kind of do it parallelly, because at the end of the day it's nothing that is too complicated, and which Vaishnavi would vouch for mathematically, nothing that you can't work probably a bit on and not improve, nothing on those lines. uh, Assuming again, DS, the kind of mistakes that you might made on DS, for Vaishnavi it was carrying on stuff from one particular statement to the other. uh, and you worked on that one. When you were writing mocks, and one of the things that I kind of paid attention to was how you were getting obviously a lot of questions wrong unnecessarily, which were careless mistakes, and those mistakes were born out of you not reading, or you misreading question, or you having that slight lack of attention while reading, and hence doing something else altogether and getting to a wrong answer obviously. Yeah, so how did you uh, ensure that you minimize that? No one can actually totally get rid of those. I'm sure you did make those mistakes in your final attempt as well.
Yeah, I'm
else
sure
the
I
score,
did.
else the score would have been 730 or 740 maybe, but
Yeah.
you minimize that to an extent which led you to arrive at 700. But that, it just kind of it just struck me how often you'd make that mistake. So how did you ensure that you stopped doing that?
So this is actually going to be really funny, and I haven't shared this with anyone because I thought it was extremely lame.
It's
Um,
not.
I yeah, you're right. I made a lot of these silly mistakes where I wouldn't read the question properly at all.
Mm,
I would, I don't know, if there's an eight there, for some reason in my head there would be a six, and I would use that and then be like, huh, why am I not getting the answer?
mm,
And there's just not enough time for you to keep rereading the question and like understanding it.
yeah,
So the funny thing that I did was, and people can judge me for it, I started meditating every morning.
I
And
don't
I did
think
it for like
that
15 minutes a day. Yeah.
that
I mean, it may work for some people, it may not work for some people, but I think it really, really helped me for sure.
yeah.
Um, yeah. And also because I started talking to this professional for my mental health podcast. I started talking to a professional,
Mm.
and we are working on a project about propagating meditation. So it's like, let me try it out and see if it works for me. And I think it definitely did work for me. I started making fewer and fewer of those mistakes. While I'm sure I would have definitely made those mistakes in my final. But I think it at least helped me get over the initial barrier.
Yeah, yeah, I think a wonderful point here. So now meditation per se is not what we are promoting here. The
Yes.
point is that you do something and you identify a gap which is not necessarily an academic gap, yeah, and you try to work on that, and whatever works for you, yeah, being in a happy place, be it whatever that puts you in that happy place, that puts you in that zone where you can concentrate better, whatever that might be. But identifying that is half the battle won, really, because once you do that, you can, whatever suits you can bring that into your routine on a daily basis to work on that, and that is really essential. More often than not, it's not the academics that beats people on GMAT, it's who they are themselves. Yeah, so you really need to improve on that to be able to score better. And I think it's a wonderful story, something that I'll be sharing with a lot of students in future as well, as to how Vaishnavi overcame that habit. Because I remember specifically, I remember that I gave about a set of 50 to 70 questions to Vaishnavi and said, don't solve them. Just write what the statement asked of you. That's it.
Yeah.
Don't solve that because you're just making a mess out of it for some reason. And that's how it goes. You need to be really honest with the kind of mistakes you're making, and that's where the practice has to be targeted at. Practice is not always solving questions. Practice for Vaishnavi to a large extent was meditating, which showed up and led her improve her concentration.
Yeah. And I think
Yeah.
also, I think what people don't realize more often than not is it's not so much a test of how much have you studied, it's more of how much have you reflected about what your habits are and what you've sort of done to sort of break those habits. And like I said, even in my error log was detailed to the point that I made it what was my emotional state when I was writing the test, even, I
Mm.
think those things were very helpful for me. Was I tired when I was writing the test? Those things, all of them play a factor, and they will all play a factor even leading up to the point of giving your test. I think setting a routine, make even the tests that you give, the mocks that you give, if you give it at the same time that you're going to give your final test, that makes a sea change also in your performance.
Right, very interesting. Yeah, so uh, I think that's a wonderful point. It's, a lot of the prep is presumed to be academic. It might not necessarily be that way. And in fact, I can vouch for that. The fact that a student who has done so wonderfully and, such a strong analysis game vouches for that is something that I want everyone to take note of, because this is something that I talk a lot about in my classes. Yeah, so just analysis plays a much more role, a more important role than practicing a lot of questions. That is really really important. uh, I think that's wonderful. uh, so yeah, um, talk me through the phase, when obviously the lockdown struck and you took a bit of a break there, and how did you come back to it, because a lot of students did do that, and some of them would be writing GMAT in a bit of time. How did you ensure that you come back to the prep and ensure that you're totally comfortable with all the basics that you would have done 6 to 8 months back, and how did you ensure that you revised properly and got back into the groove of it?
So I had taken notes when I was in class, and I'd made them fairly detailed as well. So what worked for me, I think, is when I came back from the lockdown and decided I was like going to start giving the test again, I referred back to those. And each time I did the concept, I made sure I was solving the questions simultaneously. And not just of that topic, but of other topics as well, even if
Right.
I got them wrong. And if I got them wrong, it would just become like a point in my error log that I've got this wrong. Then when I'd get to the concept for that specific topic, I would go back to that question and see what I did wrong there.
mm,
So I think that process also helped me, where I didn't get too bored while doing the questions. It kept it new and interesting the whole time.
mm.
And I think it kind of sharpened my senses also in terms of what I'm going to focus on, what the topics are. It kept me on my feet essentially.
All right. Yeah. So notes, you got to make them. You got to make them detailed. Yeah, and pay proper attention. I once had a student who, brought a notepad of, just sticky notes to make notes in the classes. He didn't end up scoring that well. So, very important is to make proper notes, and something that a lot of you would have discovered while going back, though we have ensured that we have all the content out there, be it concept videos or foundation webinars or application videos. But notes are also reflective of where a part of notes, it's not just what the question and the solution of it, rather where you struggled, and noting that down and what you did to correct that. That is an essential part of note making. So I hope you are making a note of that as well. Yeah, yeah. You wanted to
But
say
I
something.
think I'm a fan of sticky notes also, so I'm not opposed to them at all. I think I made like flashcards of the sticky notes, and I would just like, whenever I had free time, I would just like revise those. So they had like, key formula, or they'd even actually have questions that I got wrong. Like I'd just write it in tiny detail.
Mm-hmm.
So whenever I had any free time, I'd just like flip through them and like look at them. I don't know. It just made it a fun process, to be honest.
Your cheat sheet, in a way, your cheat sheet, the things that you'd like to visit regularly, yeah, and
Yeah.
go through regularly. I think that cheat sheet is a very important tool and something that Vaishnavi used as well. The what I was talking about, someone who didn't bother with the notes and just instead of a notebook brought that little thing of sticky notes. Anyway, that's a different story. Uh, yeah. So at this stage, any question that you're asking, you can please ask through the chat or through the Q&A box as well, and we'll start taking them up in about 5 to 7 minutes. So Vaishnavi, we kind of before your first attempt, you were scoring around, in a 650 to 700 range on mocks, and when you scored a 590, how hard was it a factor for you to overcome and think about a second attempt post that? Because it happens with a lot of people, and I want those of you, many of you who are out there watching this webinar right now, I want you to make note of this. So what was it like and how did you cope up with that?
I think when I got the 590, I was very shocked because I was not expecting it at all. From my mocks, at least, I, just thought that I there was no way I was getting that score for sure. I thought something must have
Mhm.
been wrong.
Yeah.
But the main mistake I made, and I think the GMAT also penalizes you a lot more if you're unable to finish your test. If you miss
Right.
questions, it's a lot worse than you skipping questions.
Right.
So then it just came down to time management and being in more of a test like environment.
Mm,
When I was giving my mocks prior to the first GMAT attempt, I had a tendency of doing one section, taking a break, coming back, and then doing the next section.
mm,
And that was never going to make me prepared for doing the real thing. So I just stopped taking
mm.
breaks in between. I did the quant
Yeah.
and verbal section simultaneously without any breaks, and at the time that I was going to give the test. So that made it a very GMAT like environment, keeping the pressure on continuously. So
Right.
I think, as far as convincing myself was concerned, my objectives were very clear. I knew why I had to give the GMAT. I knew there wasn't another opportunity for me. I needed this safety net. I still need it, So instead of rationalizing to yourself that I have XYZ things I could do if this doesn't work out, I think if
Mm,
you set your mind to this is what I need to get and be very goal driven about it, it
mm.
shouldn't be a problem.
All right. Yeah. So uh, having that clarity that there has to be no other way but to write that. And one of the important things that what I personally have noticed, and Vaishnavi is one of such students recently, that sometimes even though she was doing very nicely on the mocks, the first attempt can really take you by surprise because it's a different ball game altogether, writing a mock and writing the actual test. You're not really sure of how the extent to which you might be nervous at the day, and the kind of even a couple of mistakes here and there can throw you off really. So always, kind of have GMAT. One strong thing, one good thing about GMAT is it allows you to, attempt the test multiple times. So take that in your stride, and that will also help you, uh, you know, be uh, be less stressed in your first attempt when you have that knowledge that you can write it again. And many of the people have, made such grounds as Vaishnavi has. A 110-point jump is a significant jump, and all through just mocks and mock analysis that came from the understanding that conceptually there's nothing amiss. It were the other things, and those are what she kind of, ensured were out of the way through the 5 to 7 mocks, you might have written that time. So a question from my end: what was the number of mocks that you write between these two attempts? Do you
So
remember?
I think when I gave the first attempt, I took a break for a week. Again, I needed to step away to like really calm myself down and be like, I'm going to give this again.
One has to. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
very
But
important.
thereon, I did about 2 mocks, me pushing it 3 mocks in a
Mm,
week, and I continued my regular routine.
mm,
Um, I didn't do any additional studying, and you recommended this to me. You said do a mock one day, don't analyze it the same day, analyze it the next day.
mm.
So you give yourself enough break from doing it, and it doesn't become such a uphill mountain to climb.
Right,
So I think that also helped me. I think spacing it out also definitely helped me.
right. So spacing it out over a period of time where it's not stressful, but just a part of a routine. And I think very, very important. Write a mock one day, analyze the next day, work on identify your gaps, work on the gaps, write the next mock. That's the drill. And if you just do that, and a lot of, a few students, are not a lot, few students, some other like Vaishnavi have managed to do that, and analysis will really, bring out the results. So we'll just take a few questions right now, from some of the students. Uh, right. So as someone who's also a working professional, what was your, how did you pace your studies, and what kind of time did you devote to prepping for GMAT along with your work? How
So
did you manage that?
yeah, so I needed to make sure that I was in at work by 9:30, 10. So, and I'm a morning person.
Mm,
So for my second attempt, I just would wake up really early in the morning. I had no problem waking up early, even at 5 a.m. if necessary.
mm,
So, that's when I would wake up. I would, do my routine and then sit down and start to give my test and then go to work. Then the next day, and I wouldn't like I said, I wouldn't revise the test the same day. Same
mm.
thing the next day, wake up early, study and understand what went wrong, revise the concepts, and just the drill. So I think as a working professional, it does get a little challenging sometimes when you have a lot of other projects and things in your mind, but it can also be a blessing because if you're only doing the GMAT, you probably will put a lot more pressure on yourself um, than if you're working also simultaneously.
Right, a very interesting point. Yeah, it's not the end of the world. A lot of other things to look at, and it's just one of the things that you're doing at the moment, preparing for GMAT. So, yeah, let me just take up a few more questions. So, this is a question from Nishtha. Are there typical time slots of GMAT so that you can everyday practice it at that time? So, yeah, with the online thing, Vaishnavi, and you can watch for that, I think you can book it at any time. If you can just talk through what the booking process was, how you chose
Yeah,
a particular time.
yeah, you can book it really at any time. And I remember having this conversation with you as well. Someone who's booked it at like 1 a.m. So it can really be booked at any time. There isn't a chance, but do it in advance so the time slot you're looking for, you'll at least get. I would say like a week in advance, if you make a booking, you should get the time slot you're looking for.
Right. So there it goes, Nisha. And the other part, I think Vaishnavi has already answered that. If you write your mocks at that time, you just your entire body, mind, and system gets used to be working at its most efficient. So you're better prepped at writing the test at that point of time. Akshay asks, for how long did you take the first break? And what was your mental status regarding the exam prep and real day exam strategy? Yeah, so essentially, the kind of break that you took, I think in the lockdown, you took that break, not between the two tests he's talking about. And what was your feeling on the exam days? How would you feel on an exam day? And how would you tackle it?
I've always been a nervous wreck. Even during my mocks, I would be too scared to write a mock. So I've had an anxiety issue with almost every mock I've given. On the test day, it wouldn't be any better. So, a little fun fact in this is my first test that I booked was an online test. And I, that night couldn't really sleep too well. But I was like, okay, I'm ready to give this now. I've studied for it. When I sit
Mhm.
down for the online test, my screen just went absolutely blank. And I didn't have my phone on me. So I kept waiting around for 30 minutes,
Mm.
wondering why it's not working.
Yeah.
Finally, I had to shut it down and I called Pearson up and I was like, this did not work out for me, and booked
Mm.
it immediately the next day. Now, for an anxious person to have this episode will just triple the anxiety. So again, right before my in-center test, I was stressing out. I hadn't slept the night, and of course, I bombed my test. It did not go well at all. But that being said, you have to think of what practices you can do to help you get better. For me, I think giving the mock test at the same time that I was planning to give my final test, making sure I wasn't taking any breaks in between either of the two sections, and timing myself for every 10 question mark. I had a time slot that I need to finish this within this amount of time. I think those things really helped me.
Right. So a process arrived at, and be it timing yourself, be it being in that zone, yeah, just to tackle if you're someone who also has a tendency to be jittery or anxious coming the exam day, then how do you tackle that? And one of the things that I can say for surely, and something that Vaishnavi would kind of retain for her entire life is how she did that and managed that. It goes beyond just scoring a 700 on GMAT, but really how to overcome those things with simple processes put in place. I think that goes on to say a lot. Meera has a question. Before taking a mock, does it make sense going through the questions you got wrong in the previous mocks to make a mental note of the things that you should not repeat?
This is where I think the error log really comes to use. So in my final test, a day before, and even actually 2 days before, I stopped writing and like solving any more questions. I
Mhm.
had done the prep that I had to do. I was like, I'm not going to try any harder. We're just going to see how it goes in the test. But having that error log, I had like key points that I generally tend to make a mistake in kind of be reflected there. And my
Right,
flashcards help me a lot. So I think at least a day up to your final test, don't sit to solve any more questions. Take a break, keep it light and
right,
easy, so that
right,
you're not stressed out.
right. So cheat notes, revisiting stuff that is important that you might think that you might forget, just that, and no nothing else apart from that, especially in the last 2 3 days of just before your prep. Another question from Nishtha: is it okay to take longer than 3 months for prep? Of course. Vaishnavi did took three more than 3 months. Yeah, obviously there was a lockdown, a big thing called lockdown in between. But yeah, there's eventually a stage. So when did you decide that you want to write, or that you need to book a particular date for GMAT? What was it? Was it the deadlines that you considered before booking a date for GMAT, or was it your prep state, the stage of your preparation, and how confident you felt about attempting GMAT?
I think it was a mixture of both. I knew that I wanted to apply either in round one or round two, uh, which falls in round one falls in for most schools in October and round two in January. So I had that timeline in mind when I
Mm,
started this journey, and
mm,
I think it was very important for me to understand that there's a specific score that I'm willing to settle for, a range that I'm willing to settle for. And that was from the 650 to 700 and 700 plus range. So
Right.
having that clarity of what score you should get also helps. And that again, back work it. Understand what your academic record has been, what your work experience has been,
Mm.
and what schools you're looking at.
Yeah.
So then you can really have a better, clearer picture of what score range you should be trying for.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, comes boils down to clarity as far as the question of being confident, with the scores. Well, let me share one very interesting thing. So Vaishnavi approached me and said, I'm really anxious about GMAT mock, and I thought she's saying GMAT. I said, yeah, everyone is. But then she was really nervous about writing her first mock.
Yeah.
So yeah, just having those processes, and it's I just love this story because how she overcame that with processes in place, and to a place where it's kind of history being anxious, and that kind of having controlling you rather than you putting process in place and overcoming that. uh, uh, Last question that we take, and we'll kind of, and before I take this question, I just want your supposed the 700, what have you been doing to ensure that you have a robust application that gives you the best chance to crack the programs that you wish to?
Yeah. So I think it's a myth that you will get a 700 and you're guaranteed, or a 700 plus, and you're guaranteed to get into a great school. I'll
Yeah.
share a story of a friend of mine. He has the perfect academic record. He is a CA ranker.
Mm.
He has worked in high profile companies, in two private equities. He has a 730 GMAT, everything going on for him. And he has
Mm.
done round one applications to the T15 schools, and he's been rejected from every one of them.
Mm.
So my key takeaway from that, from his process, was don't just fixate on the GMAT. It is not the end of the world if you get even a 650. You need to start doing your research very early on for your MBA colleges. You need to start speaking to alumni, understand what they did right in their application, what worked for them. In fact, right before this conversation, I was on a Zoom meeting with the AdCom for Fuqua, and they were talking about a detailed presentation they were doing about what you should do in an interview process.
Mm.
So imagine the school is telling you what you should do when you come to interview for them, you
Yeah.
know and you get direct access to these admissions committee professionals, to MBA alumni, and they're more than willing to help you out to succeed in your MBA journey. It isn't as simple as applying to, first of all, MBA is a very competitive degree anyway to get in admission into. So you want to be sure that you've done enough research for each and every school. And I think also crafting your story, what sets you apart, identifying what are the lacks that you have in your profile. Are you not strong enough in your extracurriculars? Is your academic record poor? Do you think you want to get a higher GMAT? So there are multiple factors that go into it, but don't be in the under the impression that if you get 700, 730, that's going to sort everything out for you. That's not true.
Mm. Right. Very important, very interesting. It's really, GMAT, a great GMAT score obviously boosts your chances, but a lot of research that goes into it, and a lot of the things that Vaishnavi has done that I know of, to ensure that that application comes out robust. And more than that, I think application coming out robust is just a byproduct of one having a great clarity and vision about, what they really want to do in the future. And, and you have an access to a lot of information out there. All the experts, would reach out to you to help you. So kind of be proactive on that front. That really speaks a lot. You talk to the alumni, talk to the people who know stuff, and just don't take your GMAT score for granted. Is I think what Vaishnavi means here. So the last question that I'd want to take, because this comes from someone who has just started their prep, and this would be a nice way to finish it off. So Sonali has recently joined the GMAT course and just attended one class. What are the things that you would suggest as she has just begun her journey? Any tips for Sonali and all the people out there who have just started?
I think don't get too overwhelmed by this process. Um, it's not a do or die situation for sure. You have to put your best foot forward. And when, as far as practicing is concerned, while your classes are going on, go back home and revise what they've done. You don't want to be in a position that I was in, where I just went to the classes because I knew I had to go to the classes, but didn't go back home and do my homework. Your process will be a lot faster if you get invested faster and soon enough.
Mm,
So I think that is definitely something that I would say to any person who's just starting their journey.
right, great. Wonderful. Yes, revise, be regular. It's not the end of the word. So take it like just another thing that you're doing. So thanks, Vaishnavi. That was wonderful. A lot of wonderful insights that came from you, which I believe a lot of students would, uh, you know, kind of would have made a note of and would implement as a part of their own prep. And I wish you all the best with the remainder of your application process.
Thank you.
And thanks a lot for doing this for us. All the best and take care. And
Thank you.
thank you from all the students from the end of all the students who are attending as well. And thank you all of you who attended to take out time. And I hope you do implement the stuff that Vaishnavi talked about. And I would be sharing the recording of the same on the Telegram groups. Yeah, do keep yourself tuned to that. So thanks, Vaishnavi. Thanks, everyone. And good night, everyone. Take care, all of you. And most importantly, stay safe. Yeah,
Thank you, sir. Bye bye.
bye.